Hello, health champions. Today we're going to talk about the top 10 foods you absolutely do not want to eat if you want to have a long and healthy life. And these are in no particular order, but we're going to jump straight in. And number one would be sugar on this list. And there's so many things wrong with sugar. I can't cover them all. But for one thing, it's empty calories, meaning if you get calories but no real nutrition, you will tend to overeat. Secondly, it raises glucose, blood glucose, because 50% of sugar is glucose. And when blood glucose goes up, it also triggers insulin. If we eat a lot of this a long time for regular time, then we will tend to develop insulin resistance. So that's the first half of insulin resistance. The second part, most people don't realize, but half of sugar is fructose. And fructose doesn't raise blood sugar per se, but fructose causes non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And there are two things that humans consume that clog up the liver, that overwhelm the liver. One is alcohol and the other is fructose. So there's no other tissue in the body that can process and break down alcohol and fructose. So if you eat 100 grams of food, then you can spread that food out evenly over all of the body cells if it is fat or glucose or protein. But alcohol and fructose have to be going through the liver. And if you weigh 200 pounds and you have a 3-pound liver, then the potential to overwhelm the liver is about 70 times greater with alcohol and fructose than it is with other sources of calories. So this is why we want to avoid fructose so much and why sugar acts to create insulin resistance in two different ways, by raising blood sugar and by causing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And it's kind of ironic that it's become this way because sugar is one of the most natural molecules that there is. There's a little bit in almost every form of food that we eat. The problem is that we're eating way, way, way too much. So if you are metabolically healthy, if you don't have a condition, you don't have a disease, and you're at your ideal weight, you can probably eat 10 to 20 grams per day and be totally fine, which is what humans have done for several hundred years until the very last century here when it's been increasing dramatically. The guidelines say about 50 grams per day, and I believe that is way, way too much. And once we get up to over 100 grams, which is the average of what people actually eat, then that is a pure disaster. That's causing the epidemic of degenerative disease and metabolic disease that we're facing today. So most disease is actually caused by sugar and by the fact that we eat so much. Even though it is a natural molecule and a tiny, tiny amount should be okay in theory, if we start eating a lot, then it's a disaster. But what about moderation? Can you eat a little bit and be fine? And the answer is it's different for different people. It's going to work for some people. Like I said, if you're healthy and you're metabolically fine and you can have a teaspoon or 2 or 3 throughout the day, and it doesn't trigger any other cravings or overeating, then you're probably fine. But for a lot of people, sugar is like alcohol to an alcoholic, that if you have just a little bit, it sets off, it spins out of control, and you got to have more and more and more. So if that's the case, then you have to be honest with yourself, and you probably need to cut it out entirely. But then there's always these people who watch some videos and then they come back and comment and they say, oh, that's too extreme. That's not how it works. And they tell me about their grandparents or some relative who, my grandpa lived to be 105 and he never took care of himself. He never exercised. He ate red meat, bacon, and eggs, and all the things that are supposed to be bad for you, but not really. And he ate sugar, and he smoked, and he drank. So out of this list, it's really the smoking is probably the worst, and the sugar would be second, and drinking is all right in moderation. The red meat, the bacon, and the eggs are totally fine if they are raised in a healthy and natural way. If the animal was healthy and you didn't add a bunch of sugar or chemicals, then there's nothing wrong with these foods. But again, people give these examples and they point out that some people live for a long, long time despite not really taking good care of themselves. So, first of all, these people have excellent genetics. But then we also have to ask, is it really the food that is doing it, or is it the fact that they, despite eating this food, they did not develop any metabolic or inflammatory condition? Because that's really what this is all about. That if you can eat these things and not have any major metabolic or inflammatory problem, then that's not going to shorten your life significantly. And also, when our grandparents grew up, the notion of moderation was completely different. So if they had a soda, there might have been a 6-ounce soda twice a week, not 2 gallons a week or a 6-pack every couple of days. So moderation is something that has changed over time. And also, our grandparents didn't have access to nearly the amount of processed food and sugar, and they weren't exposed to as many chemicals as we are either, through preservatives and environmental pollution. So we have to keep all of those things in mind. So as we talk about these foods to live longer, we want to keep in mind what the goal is, because what actually shortens life is metabolic disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So if we can reduce metabolic disease, if we can reduce inflammation, if we can reduce oxidative stress and toxicity, then that is where we can be healthy and live a longer life. And metabolic disease have to do with sugar and carbohydrates that drive insulin, causes fatty liver, that clogs up the body, that causes overeating. And inflammation is partly caused by metabolic disease, but there are other things as well. So if people have a sensitivity, people have allergies, that also drives inflammation. And if you have an inflammatory condition in your gut, if you have a leaky gut, if you have poor microbiome, then that can also increase inflammation. So we want to reduce that. Oxidative stress are things like emotional stress can contribute to that, but it's primarily things like smoking and chemicals in our environment that are going to cause the oxidative stress. And then there's other forms of toxicity like pesticides and environmental pollution. And why we want to avoid those is because they drive all the major diseases. We call these things different conditions like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, stroke, and cancer. But they really fall very much under the same umbrella, which are driven by metabolic disease, inflammation, oxidative stress, and toxicity. It's metabolic syndrome and toxicity that really drive all of this. So food can have a lot to do with that, and we will talk about food, but we also have to realize that there are many other factors as well, that we can't just look at our people, our grandpa who lives to be 100 and say that this is what he did. We have to look at the bigger picture. So they have determined there are certain areas in the world called blue zones. And these are areas where people on average live longer. They live a few years extra over the most other countries, but also they have a higher number, higher percentage of people who reach 100 years old. And here's what they have found now. A lot of times people tell me that, oh, you shouldn't eat red meat because the people in the blue zones are vegetarians. And no, they're not. But more than that, we want to look at what are the other factors, just so we get the bigger picture. So the things they have in common, all these areas, is that they move naturally. It's part of their lifestyle is to constantly keep moving, whether it's agriculture or they're just walking or doing things. They're moving throughout the day. They don't have to go to the gym. They don't have to pump iron, but they constantly move. They take thousands and thousands and thousands of steps and move through a range of motion through the day. They also have a purpose. It doesn't necessarily mean to be a CEO or make millions, but within their communities, they have a purpose. They also know how to downshift. They know how to work and then how to stop working and relaxing and winding down, something that a lot of modern people have lost that ability. 4, they eat in moderation, mostly because traditionally they didn't have a whole lot of food, but also because they stick to whole food that helps regulate their appetite much better. Number 5, they eat mostly plant-based because, again, plants are what they grew and that's what was available. And I believe that we should eat a lot of plant food, but I also think that it doesn't mean that we can't eat meat. What it really comes down to is that we want to eat the quality of food. It's not so much do we eat grain or potatoes or meat or fish. It's the quality of those things and to what degree we process and destroy them that matters. Number 6, they drink wine. They drink regular and in moderation most days because wine is a part of their culture. It's a beverage for the meal. So they have 1 or 2 glasses, but they don't drink to excess. They also have typically a strong faith and a strong community that they're part of with that faith. And they keep family together. So their parents and their grandparents typically stay in the same household for a lifetime, which keeps them very tight-knit and very close together. They have a social network in addition to all these different things. They're very strong social networks that keep them engaged. And of course, you have to, on top of that, if you want to reach 100, you have to also win the genetic lottery. But I'm going through this list because I want to point out that we talk so much about these people being vegetarians or meat eaters, but in fact, there's only 2 items here that have to do with food. And even there, it's not whether you eat plants or meat. It's about the quality and moderation and the balance of life as a whole. And the second food you want to avoid is plant oils. And here I get a lot of comments also because people say, well, you promote olive oil and coconut oil, and then you say plant oils are bad. So we have to understand the difference there as well, that the ones to avoid are soybean, corn, canola, which is sometimes called rapeseed. These are plants, but they're very, very high in omega-6s. And they're very, very highly processed. They're processed with tremendous heat, with a lot of pressure, and sometimes even chemicals and solvents to get the oil out of these grains and seeds and legumes, etc. So it's not all plant oils. It's how harshly do we have to process them to get the oils out. And that's the real issue. Very highly processed that makes them that causes oxidative stress. So on the other hand, extra virgin olive oil, coconut oil, palm oil are totally fine because they are very, very high. They're kind of soft fruits, soft plants, and they're very high in fat. So you don't have to apply tremendous pressure and heat. You can just squeeze a little bit and out comes the oil. And people also often ask about the palm oil because there's a lot of controversy around that. And palm oil is totally fine. What's not fine is when they produce it, there's a lot of talk about deforestation and child labor and things like that. So that's not the palm oil's fault. That's just greedy or uninformed humans who produce it that way. But palm oil in itself is fine, and make sure that you get a sustainable palm oil if you're going to use that. So extra virgin olive oil is mostly monounsaturated. Coconut oil is mostly saturated, and palm oil is about half and half. So they use these in different types of foods and different products when they're looking for certain properties. But the key, again, is not whether it's monounsaturated or saturated. That really doesn't matter as far as health goes. What matters is that they're minimally processed. The third thing you want to avoid like the plague is margarine. So everything we said was wrong with the harshly processed plant oils still holds true for margarine, because that's the kind of oil they use. But then they abuse it a little further, and they do something called partial hydrogenation, which means they bombard it with hydrogens. And in doing that, they create something called trans fat, which is still unsaturated, but it behaves a lot like a saturated fat. And here's how that works. So if you have a fatty acid, and we're getting at just a tiny bit technical, but I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to tie it together and you'll understand exactly why I'm telling you this. So there are carbons in a long chain, and on each side of the carbons, we attach two hydrogens. And if there are two hydrogens, it's called fully saturated. And then we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and it goes on. And when it's fully saturated, we have hydrogens all the way. However, when something is unsaturated, now we have carbons with a double bond between them. So here there's just one bond between the carbons. If there's two bonds, now there's not room, there's not enough connections to put hydrogens on all the carbons. So now instead of two hydrogens, we only have one. And here is when the hydrogens are on the same side, this is called cis. That's just a chemical notation, meaning that they're on the same side. And what happens when they're on the same side is they push each other apart, and we get a bent molecule. So this, instead of being straight, we get to the double bond, and now that molecule is bent. So when it's unsaturated, it is more liquid in room temperature, and that's the difference between oils and solid fats. But when we create this artificial, this industrial version of hydrogenation, then we keep the double bond, but what happens is the hydrogens end up on opposite sides. So what that means is the molecule is still straight, so we have a partially unsaturated molecule, so it should be bent, but it's not anymore, it's straight. And the problem here is we don't have enzymes to break this down. This is a man-made fat. It's a frankenfood. We have no way of dealing with this at all. And fortunately, they have realized the trans fats are really, really bad, but people still want to continue to do this. Manufacturers love to do this because it's cheap. They can use really cheap raw materials. There's very little waste because once they hydrogenate it, the product becomes shelf stable. They give them certain texture properties they're looking for, and it can stay on the shelf for a long, long time. So it saves them money. So they want to use these things, and therefore they go to every trick in the book when they can. And very often you'll see products that are called trans fat free. And I've even seen ridiculous things like trans fat free per serving. What does that mean? Either it is trans fat free or it isn't, right? No. They reduce it, they reduce the serving size to the point where the trans fats are less than 0.5 grams per serving, because now they can round it down to 0. So if it has 0.499999, then they can write trans fat free or trans fat free per serving. And it might still have 10% trans fats. So just be aware of that. Manufacturers are getting better, but there's still some that like to deceive you. And the other thing that we want to understand is about natural trans fats, because whenever I talk about trans fats being so bad, then some people say, well, meat must be really bad then because there are natural trans fats in meat. And if we look at it, then these bonds, these connections, they do look the same. there's going to be a double bond, 2 carbons, and we're going to have hydrogens on opposite sides. The difference is that when nature makes it, then it puts it in a different place. So the industrial production keeps this double bond at the 9th carbon, whereas nature puts it on the 11th. And now you're wondering, do I really need all this technical detail? And you don't really, but I'm telling you this so that you understand that nature makes it a different way. So it may not seem like a big deal if this is on the 9th or the 11th carbon, but it makes all the difference, because if nature made it, it's been around for hundreds of thousands of years, and we have the enzymes to break it down. When industry, when science does something and they move it just a couple of carbons, we don't have the enzymes anymore. Now it's a frankenfood. It's completely foreign. So even though they look very, very similar, nature has one way of doing it that works. And when we start meddling and messing with it, we create things that don't work. But like I said, fortunately, people are becoming more aware. So they are moving away from the blatant abuse of hydrogenation. And one way to do it a little better is to do something called fully hydrogenated. So now they don't just bombard it with a little heat and some hydrogens till they get this trans bond. They keep bombarding it until it's fully saturated, until it has no double bonds left. So now there is no more trans fat. The question, though, that I would want to ask is, how sure are we that they can complete that? Because if they don't complete the saturation, then we're still going to have these trans fat bonds. And the other question is that why would you even want synthetic food? Why would you want to eat something fully hydrogenated? Even if it looks better on paper than regular margarine, why not just eat butter or coconut oil or olive oil? Some of these wonderful, flavorful foods that nature has provided for us. Why do we think that we have to go and make something that is semi-plastic just because it satisfies a few more criteria? I think in my mind, the choice is pretty clear. And by the way, I actually really love science. We just need to keep it out of the food supply. That's all. So the next one, number 4, is going to be fried foods. And everything we said about the plant oils and the hydrogenation now still holds true with fried food, except now it gets even worse again. We use the plant oils. A lot of these frying foods are still going to be partially hydrogenated because it makes the oils keep longer. And now, in addition to those problems, though, now they use high heat and they reuse it. So now the high heat is going to oxidize and destroy these oils even further. And now, if they did it once, it would be bad enough. But when they use it all day long and they just keep going, batch after batch, now it gets more and more rancid and more destroyed. So a lot of times when we talk about longevity and living longer, too much of the focus, I think, is on lifespan. And I want to contrast that with health span, so we really understand what we're talking about and what the stakes are. So we do know that you can live longer by eating right, but that's not still the big deal. We know that a properly managed diabetic, for example, someone who has type 2 diabetes, who takes all their medication, they take their metformin and their insulin, they will probably live on average 10 years shorter than if they didn't have the diabetes. And that's still 10 years, but it may not seem like that huge a deal. However, then you weigh in the fact that the cost of maintaining this diabetes and the additional health problems that this person is going to have is going to run in the millions per person. And then they're probably going to have some joint pain and some immobility. And if they're overweight, then that's going to add insult to injury on that. They probably will have some reduction in vision. They probably have some lessened kidney function over the years. Maybe they'll even have some neuropathy and end up with amputations and wheelchairs, etc. Even if it's not that bad, they probably will have less energy, they'll have more brain fog, etc. because of this. And that's a well managed, that the person who does what they're told. So the biggest problem here is not just that you live shorter, it's that you have such a dramatically decreased quality of life compared to what it could be. So when people say that we live longer, medical science has helped us live longer, then I'm all in favor of saving lives and progress in various ways, but all we're really doing is we're not necessarily living longer, but we're dying longer. I think that we're supposed to live to 80, 90, 100, maybe longer, and one day just be done and not wake up. We're not supposed to have 30, 40 years where we're being managed, where we control symptoms, where we can't do the things that we love to do. So what I believe is that by eating right, then you will increase your health span by as much as 30 to 40 years. Instead of starting to degenerate and not be able to do the things you want to do from age 40, 45, 50, you should be able to have a full quality of life into your 80s and even 90s. Food number 5 is modern wheat. So grains, and especially wheat, is responsible for human civilization. We wouldn't be where we are if it wasn't for wheat. It has helped us develop societies and culture and so forth. The problem is wheat has changed. And a lot of people, they'll ask, well, is wheat GMO? And no, it's not really. There's like one country, I think Argentina, has allowed GMO wheat, but then there's some legal problems that they may not even be able to push it through. But even if it's not GMO, because GMO is genetically modified, and back when they started developing all these different strains, they didn't really have that technology, but it didn't mean that wheat isn't a frankenfood just from recombining and messing with it. So hundreds of thousands of years ago, there was one type of wheat. It was called einkorn. And then it took tens of thousands of years, and we had 2 and then 3. But until the last 50, 60, 70 years or so, when they really started recombining and playing with these genetically, there was a handful. And now there are tens of thousands of different types of wheat. And in developing all that wheat and all these different types, they were not concerned at all with human health, whether humans could digest this, what would happen to the digestive tract if you put it in. All they were concerned with was, is it resistant to weather? Is it resistant to drought? Is it resistant to strong winds, etc.? And what is the yield per acre? And maybe the third thing was, can you bake white, fluffy bread with it and not these flat, heavy things? So health was not a concern at all, any step of the way. And as a result, wheat, modern wheat, is the most common sensitivity that we find in the clinic. When we try to get people checked on food sensitivities and what they can tolerate, wheat is the absolute most common sensitivity. And it's also the most common reason for digestive upsets. And whenever you have digestive upsets and sensitivities, now you create inflammation. And a lot of people miss this because they've heard of celiacs. They know that celiacs is increasing in numbers, and they know that people with celiacs, they get terrible digestive upsets. But they figure, hey, if I don't have celiacs, then I'm fine. And that's not true, that there's this whole range of sensitivities where celiacs is the extreme, but most people do not tolerate modern wheat very well. Number 6 is diet soda and the artificial sweeteners that they put in there. Now, don't confuse this with things that are sweetened with stevia and monk fruit. Those are generally good products, but when they use sucralose and aspartame and acesulfame, potassium and saccharin, these are basically pesticides, and they have no place in human biology. So all these artificial sweeteners that they use are very detrimental to health. Another place you find artificial sweeteners now is chewing gum. And it used to be that you had sugary gum and you had sugar-free gum. That's not true anymore because they found that the flavor lasted longer with the artificial sweeteners, that whenever you had sugar, you chewed on it and the flavor went away. So now they put the artificial sweeteners in on top of the sugar. So it doesn't matter which gum you buy, you're going to get artificial sweeteners either way. Now there are some niche brands that use xylitol or other sugar alcohols, and those would be much preferred, but that flavor lasts for like milliseconds. You chew a couple of times and the flavor is gone, so most people don't go that route. But realize that no matter what commercial gum you're buying, you're going to get the artificial sweeteners. Check the labels if you don't believe me. But it's not just chewing gum and diet soda. This stuff is making its way into thousands and thousands of different products. So low-calorie desserts, low-calorie yogurts, low-fat yogurts. They know that people don't want the sugar anymore, so they start putting this artificial stuff in there instead. And if you go on a cruise, for example, they have these huge buffets, these huge tables with food and with desserts. And you have to be really careful because all of the low-calorie desserts are basically going to have this nasty stuff, the artificial sweeteners in them. And this is becoming more and more of a problem as people are becoming more aware of the low-carb lifestyle. They know that sugar causes all these problems, but they don't want to give up. They still have their sweet tooth. So now we're finding these artificial things in more and more products. Number 7 is low-fat dairy. And the biggest problem here is that it's, after wheat, it's the most common sensitivity. It's the most common thing that upsets the digestive tract and causes inflammation in different people. And one of the big problems is that it's pasteurized, so they kill off all the bacteria that would help you digest it, all the bacteria and enzymes in there. And the more processed the dairy is, the worse it is. That basically, the fat in dairy is the best part. That if you eat the full fat, the high fat dairy, you're usually going to be okay. If you eat the cream and the sour cream, especially when they're fermented, like sour cream and yogurt, you put the bacteria and the enzymes back in. Now, the vast majority of people can tolerate it. And people are also usually okay with cheese and other high-fat products. But you want to stay away from the low-fat dairy because that's where most people get their problems. Number 8 on the list is cereal. And for some reason, huge parts of the world have decided that cereal is the only thing that you can eat for breakfast. So either when you cut it out, people ask, what do you eat instead? Well, you can eat eggs and bacon and sausage. You can have a full-fat yogurt with some nuts on it. Or you can just skip breakfast altogether. That's called intermittent fasting, and I've done lots of videos on that. But some of these cereals are worse than others. So instant oats, for example, has a glycemic index of 83. It is absorbed in your bloodstream almost exactly as fast as pure glucose, which is 100. This is faster even than table sugar. So what that does, it's a highly processed food, and the more they process it, the more they increase the surface area. So your enzymes and your digestive juices can get to it and break it down fast and get that sugar into your bloodstream. I'm not saying that oats are the worst thing on the planet. So if you have a good metabolism and you like the oats, then if you do the steel-cut oats, that's completely different. It's still a high glycemic index compared to eggs and sausage or an omelette, but it's significantly less than the highly processed instant oats. But out of the cereals, the oats are probably the least harmful, the least atrocious. So a lot of people, they give the kids cereals to their kids or they eat them themselves because they're sugar addicts. So if you like your children at all, just don't get them the kids cereals. There's so many things wrong. It's grain, it's processed, it's synthetic, it's artificial colors, it's tons and tons of sugar. Again, it's almost like donuts. You couldn't try to make a worse food, really. It's got everything that you don't want in a food. Number 9 is processed foods in general. And now we're starting to see, now that you know the other items on the list and why you don't want them, you realize that a lot of processed foods are going to be based on sugar, they're going to be based on wheat, and it's going to be the processed wheat that is very high starch, that raises blood sugar, they've increased, again, the surface area. When they chop it up, then your enzymes can get to it and you digest it super fast and it jacks up your blood sugar. But that's not the end of it. They also put in preservatives and chemicals and artificial flavors and artificial colors. And when they do all this processing, also they deplete nutrients, so they're empty calories. And pretty much as bad are fast foods, because here you're still getting a lot of sugar, you're getting the wheat, you're getting the high starch. And when they cook these things, very often in the dressings, they'll use these harshly processed plant oils. If you get the fries or if you get various different fast foods, a lot of it they're going to deep fry. So again, a lot of these bad items we've talked about, they just repeat and come back and over again. And when I say fast food, those are like the chains that what we consider fast food, but also realize that a lot of restaurant food is not a whole lot better. So you want to think about, how do they prepare the food? So if you get a steak and a baked potato, or you get a salad or something, that's okay. It's better, obviously, if you get a grass-fed steak, but even so, once in a while, it's not going to kill you. But be aware of the types of oils. Are they frying everything? Are they using tons of sugar? So when you eat out, what I focus on is I try to get steak, I try to get salads. There's a lot of these restaurants where they make burrito wraps, where you can actually get a salad with the beans and the onions and the steak and so forth. And that's actually really good food. You can get some salsa with it, and Chipotle is one of them. There's several others like Moe's and Willie's. I don't want to favor anybody. But think about how they make it and what are the raw materials in here. Another thing I go for is Thai food and Mexican, because it's one of the few places that you can eat a meal and not spend a fortune, and it is dairy-free and wheat-free. So with Mexican, obviously, you want to go either for the corn tortillas or cut out the tortillas completely. And with Thai food, you want to go easy on the rice, but they use coconut, they use natural fats, and much, much less processing. Their food is based on whole food ingredients. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.